panelists. Yeah?
Okay, we're recording.
Hi, this is
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to our USSEE webinar series. Today's webinar will be a panel discussion. So my name is Regina Ostergaard-Clem. I'm from Hawaii Pacific University, and I'm a board member for USSEE. I'm also a panelist today, so I'm going to do my best to moderate. Given the technology, I'm used to using Blackboard Collaborate, so bear with me if I stumble a little bit. So before we get started, I just want to shout out to Erin Lennox. She's our executive director, the executive director for USSEE. She's on, as well as Robbie Richardson. Robbie, are you there? Our president. And I also want to say a thank you to John Sorrentino, who is our secretary treasurer. He's hosting this session today on WebEx through Temple University. So I just want to say thanks for doing that, John. If you are a member of USSEE, welcome. And I just want to give you a quick reminder that elections are now open for board members for the next term. And those elections, the ballot is open until this Friday, June 6th. And Erin has sent out a ballot to all the members via email. So just keep your eyes open for that if you haven't voted yet. If you're not a member of USSEE, welcome. And I want to encourage you to check out our website to learn more about us. If you have any questions about what the society does and what our history is, or what kind of resources that we offer, please feel free to reach out to any of us, any of the board members that you'll see on our website. And most of us will be on this call today too. So a couple of things about housekeeping. Please use the chat box. We are going to go for about 40 minutes for the panelists, their presentations, which leaves us about 20 minutes for questions and answers, but feel free to use the chat box in the meantime to register your questions or comments. I've asked Erin to help monitor what's happening in the chat box so that she can keep up with the questions when the time comes for the Q&A. During the Q&A, I'd ask you again to use the chat box for your questions or to raise your hand. If you do have a question, you can use the little hand signal to raise your hand and tell us that you do have a question. This session, as John said, will be recorded, and you'll be able to find the recording up on the USSEE website. I don't know how long that takes John to turn around, but you'll find the recording up there, and you'll find the recording of the other webinars that we've done in the series as well for your reference. Please mute your mics unless you're the one who's presenting or asking questions, just so we can minimize background noise. So let me just kick off a little bit with an introduction to the panelists. So I'm just going to introduce the panelists all in the beginning in the order in which they're going to present rather than breaking it up in between. But first I want to thank Rob Moore, who put this panel together. He really did the heavy lifting and took the lead in pulling together the panelists and reaching out to everyone and coordinating what we're going to say today, including putting our slides together. So thanks, Rob, for taking the lead on that. I really appreciate it. So in order of, hopefully I have this order correct, just the first presenter will be Eli Lazares. So he's currently a PhD student. He's part of the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California at Berkeley. His research investigates and contributes to filling the gap between market optimization and broader social welfare. He holds an MS from Berkeley in the Energy and Resources Group as well, and a BA in Economics from San Francisco State University. So he's on the panel today because in 2018, he co-authored an article with Claire Brown that was based on his master's work, I believe, to calculate the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator for the state of California over the period of 2010 to 2014. So he'll be the first one to kick off. He'll be followed by Rob Moore, who I mentioned before. He's a principal at Scioto, and I hope I said that correctly, Scioto Analysis. I believe is that a river in Ohio?
It is, yep.
Okay, great. So that's a policy analysis firm in Columbus, Ohio. He's worked as an analyst in the public and nonprofit sectors on economic development, environment, education, and public health. He holds a Master's of Public Policy from the University of California, Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. and a BA in philosophy from Denison. And he's on the panel because he's been instrumental in creating 2 reports on GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, for the state of Ohio. And the second was just released, May 26th, like a few days ago. And that covers the period. Great, so you've been busy. That covers the period from 2009 to 2018. Mary Jane Fox, so she'll be third in our panel. She's an assistant professor in the Anderson College of Business at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. She's also the director of SEED. Let me make sure I get this correct. Sustainable Economic and Enterprise Development Institute. Okay, great. And that institute seeks to foster the development of sustainable economic enterprises, honoring humanity and the earth through education, collaborative scholarship, and convening. She holds a PhD in Natural Resources and Environment from University of Vermont, and an MS in Ecological Economics from University of Edinburgh. She's on the panel because, along with John Erickson at UVM, that they were the first to publish an estimate of GPI for all 50 states. And that resulted in an article entitled Genuine Economic Progress in the US, a 50-state study and comparative assessment, that was published in Ecological Economics in 2018. Okay, so welcome, Mary Jane. And Mary Jane, I think you used to be a USSEE board member as a student, right? I think that's when I first met you. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. And Gonzalo Barrick is a professor of economics at University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Her research and teaching areas include development economics, labor economics, and feminist economics. Her latest work is on broader metrics of economic welfare that incorporate unpaid care work and the environment. She holds an MA and a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So she co-authored a 2014 study with Erica Gaddis on Utah, GPI for Utah, and I believe that was back in 2014. And she also co-authored an article with Erica and Ken Bagstad that was titled Methodological Developments in U.S. State-Level Genuine Progress Indicators towards GPI 2.0. Sorry, I totally messed up that title. But the point was, she was one of 3 authors that took GPI to the next level and made some suggestions for what a GPI 2.0 would look like. So, and you also have a brand new, well, relatively new publication that's in International Labor Review called Measuring What Matters and Guiding Policy and Evaluation of the Genuine Progress Indicator. So she'll give us some really great insight today too. And I'll be the anchor on the panel. So as I mentioned, I'm from Hawaii Pacific University. I'm an associate professor of environmental science, and I teach in both our undergraduate environmental science and studies program and our master's degree in global leadership and sustainable development. So I came into the GPI landscape when my colleague Kirsten Olson at University of Hawaii at Manoa and I developed a GPI for the state of Hawaii in 2014. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more in my presentation. So I have a master's degree in environmental engineering and a PhD in what's called systems analysis and economics for public policy decision making from Johns Hopkins University. And I've been on the board at USSEE for about 3 years now. So with that being said, I hope we're not bumping up too much onto the time constraints, but I'm going to turn it over to Eli. And Eli, just let me know and I can advance the slides when you need it, okay?
Right, yeah. Can everybody hear me? Good or not? Thank you, and I hope this fan on my computer fan is going crazy. Hope that's not too bad. But thank you very much, Jenna, for the introduction, and Rob as well for inviting us all and getting us in here, and to everyone for joining us. I'm going to start us all off with a brief background on the Genuine Progress Indicator. Just try to get that off. So slide. Okay, to the next slide.
Okay, just give me 1 second. This one here?
Yeah, one more. Click.
Okay.
Thank you. So the GPI is a composite indicator accounting for a selection of components, each representing a specific categories of benefits and costs in the economy slide. Measured in constant dollars, that is to account for inflation slide. And so summing all the components to a total, we'll get an overall measure or indication, I'll just keep talking, of how the economy is doing. We can get a sense of how broad areas of the economy are faring in relation to each other. And we can look in detail at the individual components of each of the listed components that I had up on the slide, as you see there, and then one more click show the full list. So as I'll show briefly in the next slide, this initiative, the GPI initiative, developed out of standard GDP accounting as an attempt to be more comprehensive in measuring the state of the economy. And I'm going to keep going. Well, yeah, sorry. I want to know quickly, quickly and early on, can we, yes, go back. Okay.
Eli, I'm sorry.
No
I'm not following directions well today. It's too early in the morning for me.
I bet. If you could go back a couple of clicks, just for that list.
This one here?
Just speak to one more.
Back. This.
Yeah. Just wanted to hold on so everyone can see the list as I have it. And I wanted to note early that the selection of components is illustrated here, reflects a specific history and group of researchers. And I think it's probably particularly clear at this moment that important elements that do not directly show up on this more or less standard list, that some things aren't there, like obviously. So, for instance, there's no direct measure of the impact or legacy of racism, of racial or other forms of inequality other than income, of police violence or militarism, other human rights issues, no measure of changes in health risks, such as from a pandemic. But then again, obviously that's also true and even more so for the GDP itself. And so with that, I think other speakers might speak to that a little bit more. But GPI is one of the active initiatives that does attempt to track economic well-being more comprehensively, and it is evolving somewhat. This is the current form, at least what I'll speak about. So the selection of components that I have up on the screen is from the study that we did for California. And the US, in the introduction, we talked about the paper we published that had a time series 2010 to 2014, but I've now done a time series for California 95 to 2006, and for the US as well. So we have both of those results just recently completed, which I did, as mentioned, with Professor Claire Brown, economics from UC Berkeley, and some assistants from undergrads. And this list is approximately the standard GPI study list of components, although there's some minor variation in different studies. When we do the calculation, some of the components are already in currency terms, like for instance on the left you see personal consumption, that's like actually how much is spent on consumption. But for those which aren't, a shadow price or an implicit price is applied to value each unit of that component to estimate its total economic benefit or cost alongside all the others. And I'll give a quick example of how that's done in a couple of slides. Slide, I'm ready for the next one. This is just a quick look at the history, very quick. It evolved out of previous attempts at building a more appropriate accounting of national and regional economies. So please ignore that GDW title, that's irrelevant. No, I accidentally didn't delete it. Slide. The MEW was created as an alternative and adjustment to GNP in 1972. Click. And the ISEW was adapted from that and from a Japanese version called the NNW in the late 1980s. Click. And then researchers first created the GPI more or less in its current form in the mid-1990s. This slide is from a couple of years ago, but it gives a sense of the GPI studies and similar studies that have been published over time. The time series, which is the line, vertical lines, so the period that was covered, and the regions calculated, which you see along the bottom axis, the x-axis. I also started a table on the Wikipedia page for Genuine Progress Indicator, so that's actually more current and being updated. So if anyone's interested, check that slide. Click. So as I mentioned, I want to show quickly how the basic idea of giving a financial or sort of currency value things that don't already have one. This is a very simple example from our original California time series. So you can see, to estimate the welfare contribution of volunteer work to the economy, we found data on the average hours of volunteer work in each year, which you can see in the bottom row. And then we attribute a financial value to each of those hours. In this case, we use the average wage for California, which you see in the row more or less immediately above that. And then basically we just multiply the two. So the assumption is that volunteer hours on average is a contribution to the economy approximately equivalent to an average wage and average sort of contribution to the economy and market economy, that is. That's a very brief, but just give a quick sense of how we put everything in that one unit, that consistent unit, so we can add it all together and compare. Click. And then just very briefly, for time again, presenting here our current results. As I said, did a calculation expanding the time series from California, from that short 5-year time series from 2016. I said 2064. And then in parallel, I did a calculation for the United States, which has actually been done before. So Professor Claire Brown and I are going to, we're working on a paper to do a comparison between the results we got for the United States and previous studies of the calculations for the whole country. And hopefully one where we compare the state and the national one. I'm going to talk more about it, but I won't right now in the interest of time. And then last one, just very quickly, to round up, I have just the same results again on the left here, showing them overlapped, juxtaposed, the California and the US. And then on the right, just as a quick example here, I'm showing a comparison of the two y-axes here. On the left, just the environmental components summed together for the US and California compared, and then on the using the right y-axis, the measure of change in inequality over time for the two regions. Just to kind of give a sense of broadly how you can drill down again. That's my section. Thank you all for your time, and I very much look forward to hearing from everyone else in the discussion.
Thanks, Nye. So Rob, you're ready?
I am. Thank you so much. So you want to just go into the first slide? I'll try to save us some time on this too. So I'm going to give you some of the updates on the most recent the GPI calculation that was released last week by Scioto Analysis. We're a public policy analysis firm based in Columbus, Ohio. So we're a little bit different from some of the other groups that are based at universities. We're a social impact firm, and we've been doing this GPI for the past couple of years, updating. Ken Bagstad, who is here actually, who did the most recent Ohio GPI before Scioto Analysis started doing this. So we've been able to calculate from 2009 through 2018 and just released the number through 2018 last week. So to just give you some of the updates on how this looks like and how we communicate this from a state level, this is the consumption measure here. And as you can see, adjusted personal consumption, and this is economic indicators here. Adjusted personal consumption is the largest part of the economic indicators, and actually it's the largest part of GPI in general. So like GDP, which starts on income, this focuses on consumption. So there are some differences there, especially since consumption can be a little bit more smooth than income. But that being said, they still come from this perspective of consumption / income in the first place. And you see other things that impact the GPI are consumer durables, net investment, and on the negative side, the cost of underemployment and the cost of consumer durables. If you would go to the next slide now. From an environmental perspective, most of the environmental measures, I assume in most of the states, end up being negative, and that's because they're capturing things like the cost of non-renewables, the value and the lost value of farmland, CO2 emissions, wetland loss, water and air pollution. All these are negative. The one positive, the one that we had in Ohio, is we've seen some forest regrowth that's happened in the state of Ohio since the baseline year. So that actually does count as a positive. But on net, we do see it be the environmental impacts drag down GPI. In particular, losing a lot from use of non-renewables. That's our leaning on petroleum, but especially coal and natural gas. and the loss of farmland that we've had over time in the state of Ohio since the baseline year that it's measured from. Then next slide. More of a mixed bag on the social side, though still at a net positive. Housework and parenting is by far the biggest indicator in the social section for the state of Ohio, with higher education also having a pretty big impact. And then also positive with the value of highway and streets and volunteering. And then the biggest negative impact we have is the loss of leisure time. There's been a lot of loss of leisure time since the baseline year that we look, but also the cost of commuting is pretty significant. The cost of auto accidents, so you see how the focus on car culture and some sprawling suburbs can have an impact on well-being. And then also smaller things like cost of family breakdown, crime, household pollution abatement. And on the positive side, highways and streets and volunteering. Go to the next slide. The cool thing is with this newest study is we can actually take a look at the past 10 years. So we're looking at 2009 at the very tail end of the Great Recession up until 2018, where we've quote unquote recovered from the Great Recession. These are the top five. These are the 5 indicators that had the most progress over that time period. The top one being adjusted personal consumption, which makes sense. People are consuming more as we pull our way out of the recession, but also net investment. You see people investing more and saving more, and more investment coming from outside of the state as well. You can see employment improving. Very substantially, though, we had 400,000 more people with bachelor's degrees in Ohio in 2018 compared to 2009. And Ohio is the 37th highest state when it comes to bachelor's degree attainment. So that's sort of a weak spot for the state of Ohio compared to other states. And having more and more people with bachelor's degrees is a positive for the state. We also had a small impact, I mean, it's over $1 billion, improvements in air quality in the state of Ohio. Go to the next slide. On the negative side, these were all the indicators that had over $1 billion negative impact. These are all things that backslid by $1 billion or more on an annual basis from 2009 to 2018. The largest one is the cost of loss of farmland. And the strange thing about this is sort of this is something that's worth taking a look at, I think, with the measure. This wasn't actually loss of farmland that happened over this time period. It was the increase in value of farmland. And because the value of farmland as a whole is calculated by multiplying how much farmland has been lost since a baseline year times the market value has gone up, even though the net farmland hasn't decreased over the past 10 years, because the value that's had a substantial impact on GPI as it's measured with standard measures. We also see the value of consumer durables and the cost of consumer durables. You would expect that to go down as we get out of a recession, because during a recession, people hold on to their current consumer durables and aren't buying new ones. And as people pull their way out, they're buying new consumer durables. So that's sort of to be expected in that kind of situation. But we've also seen the increase in reliance on natural gas cause an impact on the cost of depletion of non-renewables. We've seen leisure time go down. People have been losing their free time. And we've even seen people spending less time on housework and parenting and longer commute times too, and those had significant impacts. Let's go to the last slide that I have here. This is a chart that if you know anything about GPI, you've seen a lot of. And this is Ohio from the baseline year of 2009 to the year of 2018, looking at the percentage growth in GDP versus the percentage growth in GPI. And you see here that when you take out things like environmental damage and you factor in other changes, GPI has been growing slower than GDP compared to its baseline. So we're going to be using all this information to do a number of policy briefs. We actually released a policy brief just yesterday on road pricing as a way to try to improve GPI. By reducing commute times and reducing use of non-renewables and CO2 emissions. We have policy briefs that are going to be coming out over the next 2 weeks on gas tax increases and on a cap and trade system for Ohio. Yeah, I'll hand it off now.
Thanks, Rob. Mary Jane, you're up next.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob, and thanks for pulling it together. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Jane Fox, and you can see my affiliations there. What I'm going to be presenting wasn't just work on my own. None of us really work on our own, right? We collaborate, and I had such a great team working with me on this content I'm about to share, so you can see some of the shout outs there. So next slide, please. So I want to start this entire through of my collection of slides is going to be this question about to whom or what does GPI give power? So GPI is over 30 years old, maybe older, depending on when you start dating it. And economic theory and our understanding of sustainability, inclusivity, power, and ecology, all of these things have evolved in that time period. We see more research in feminist economics, understanding of indigenous knowledge, understanding of inequality and the importance of wealth inequality, not just income inequality, planetary boundaries, all these things. So a big question is there is power embedded in the metric and in the design process itself. And so we haven't used the chat box yet, but some of you know a lot about GPI. Some of you are having your first exposure now. Would you be so kind as to participate and tell me some thoughts in the box about to whom or what do you think GPI gives power? Interpret this however you wish. In the coming slides, I will interpret it in many different ways, but if you could be a participant, I'm just curious to see where we start with your thoughts. Thanks, Rob. Policy makers. I know you may not have been expecting to participate, and I know that it takes time to type, so I don't take it, the quiet, as a bad sign. It might just mean you're thinking and typing. Yay, thanks. Thanks, Ken. Landlords. Popping up. Oliver says care workers. John Erickson says power to white male privilege status quo. So there's a lot of awesome thoughts coming in, and I'm sure you can read them all too. Thank you. Thanks for jumping in and doing that. Next slide, please.
Sorry, is that too far?
No problem. So no, this is good. So just one slide on my methods. I was looking at the OECD handbook. If you haven't looked at this and you're interested in indicators, this is a really helpful tool because it has a collection of the best practices for constructing a composite indicator, which is what GPI is. So I looked at their recommendations and also some of the data choices. There's different ways to calculate GPI. There's a couple of different methods. Could you click one more time, please? This collection, the data is from 2011, so it's old now, but I used with the team the Vermont, Maryland methodology, and we used a mixture of state data when possible and federal data and adjusted it to state when necessary. Next slide, please. So here's some results. This question around what are the key components that drive state GPI results? And so this is a way of thinking about this power question. To whom or what does GPI give power? Well, the US population weighted average for the 50 states, we found that the top 4 contributors to GPI, meaning the top 4 most important things maybe for policymakers to look at according to how this metric is designed, personal consumption expenditure is number 1, and that composed 38.2% of our GPI for this US population weighted average. And then the cost of non-renewable energy resource depletion was ranked number 2 in most important or biggest contributor. The next was the cost of inequality, and then benefits of housework. So if you were taking a snapshot of GPI and you didn't know much about it and you wanted to understand what's considered the most important thing in GPI in terms of weight or how much it contributes to this metric, these would be your top 4 things. So this leads to some questions around what type of policy action might be prescribed by the ranking of these things. It also can give us one lens of looking at where is the power, what are the things that have been designed in to be the heaviest weighted or the biggest components. Next slide, please. One more click. maybe it's more than one more. Can you just click a couple times? Yeah, that's next one more. Thank you. So again, this is another question around to whom and what does it give power, because we're looking at here different assumptions that the designers built into this version of the metric. Again, GPI has a couple of different ways to be calculated, but in this version, here's a snapshot of two different components, the household labor component, climate change component. So for our study, we sensitized all the different components in different ways to look at and understand how the different weightings based on different wage rates or difference in the social cost of carbon, what we could find through sensitivity to help us understand what we've chosen more. And so if we first look at this benefit of household labor, feminist economists, and I would argue that household labor is foundational to the reproduction of society, and that it's undervaluing it undervalues caring labor and potentially women. And so the question of, well, how did this get weighted? So household labor is built in the model. It is currently, at least in this version, this maid's wage. And so the question is, why was it the maid's wage? Why not the janitor's wage? Janitors, there's a gender difference there, and it is a slightly higher wage. And so if we use the janitor's wage, we saw that there was an increase in GPI because that was weighted more heavily with a higher wage rate of almost 6% higher. But then the question is, why would we use the market, a market number that's different than we're using, which we'll see in a moment in the next slides, for the average? Why don't we use the average wage? We use it for volunteer labor. We use it for various other like leisure time. So why not use the average wage for this? Why don't we say household labor is weighted at the average wage? And what would this say about power and maybe feminism and equality? And so when we do that, we see that it becomes the second most important component for this version of GPI and increases GPI by 44%. So then this other example I want to talk through, this is a social one. The next one is an environmental component, and it is a cost instead of a benefit. So the cost of climate change. This had a lot of opportunities for sensitizing and understanding choices that were made. So in our calculation, in the original calculation, it came from a mean value from a 2005 meta-analysis of 103 different studies. And so that was weighting the social cost of carbon as $128 per ton. And so that gave us a rank in terms of how important was climate change inside GPI. It was 9th most important, or highest ranked. So why don't we look at the option of using the EU emissions trading scheme, which was about $10 per ton in 2016. And so that changed the cost, which meant the cost was less, which meant GPI went up. What if we use the White House range from that time, which was 40, and we can see, of course, GPI went up because this cost went down. But then we could look at, there's a study in Nature that found the cost to be 220. And so if we use that, then we see that GPI went down by 10% because this cost went up. So the power of the decision makers, what social cost of carbon are we using, is really, really important. You can also look at the option of scaling up emissions, which is the other side of the coin. And so there have been studies like Bagstad's, Ken's study and all, I can't remember his other co-authors, forgive me, but they were looking at the cost of climate change differently by disaggregating this, or suggesting this disaggregation, looking at the cost of extreme events, natural disasters, water scarcity. And so that could be another way of thinking about weighting this, or about the power for policymakers in this discussion. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go deeply into this, but again, this question of who gets to decide the weighting and what happens in terms of power and policymaking when we change the weighting. If we decide if we use the average wage to weight these 3 costs and 1 benefit, you can see in the top box, when we have higher wages, GPI goes down. And so there's a question there around what does that mean for those that are advocating for a livable wage or a higher minimum wage? If states, if we're looking at this through the state lens, are advocating for that, but then their GPI numbers go down. There's also this kind of policy lever perspective and power. It really would be concerning that if the argument could be made against increasing minimum wage because it could potentially decrease your state GPI. And then I have a lot more to say about that, but I know we don't have time. Please ask questions if you have them at the end. Cost of inequality, again, power in this. This is the cost of income inequality using a Gini, so it's not looking at wealth, which we know have substantial racial components, and especially in the context we're living in, all up until this time, but what is very, very bright and loud right now for everybody is this question of how we can improve our country's race equality. I don't even have the words for it right now, and so I apologize if I'm not being eloquent, but this idea of we have this cost of inequality built into GPI, but does it actually do what it needs to do? Does it actually compel policy to change in the way it needs to? And the power of, if we chose a different baseline, this calculation is based on a baseline. If we choose a different baseline, we would get a different result. So if we chose to have a baseline that was slightly higher, which was our Gini coefficient in the US in 1999, we would see GPI go up a lot because we just chose a different baseline, that we were more comfortable with more income inequality. But if we chose a lower baseline to start our calculation from, closer to 0.3, then we would see our GPI go down substantially by over 25%. Next slide. Click again, please. And one more. Yep. So this is if you could go back, the slide about the states. This is again a question of power and decision makers, because depending on which states come out on top, they may want to advocate for using GPI. And the states that don't win this game, but do win the gross state product game, they may want to stay with that metric. So if part of the desire is to see a use of an alternative measure, looking at maybe what could be considered the winners and the losers and how we legislate might be important. So you can see Alaska is actually the highest state in both cases, but this really is because of an outlier related to how we measure ecosystem services in this version of GPI. But you can see certain states, if you look at the one table on the right, that some states have high GPI and high gross state product. Some states have high GPI and low state product, and those are the ones that are dark, and they may be the states that would be interested in advocating for a GPI shift for the country. So this question again around what is the political motivations and where is their power there. Next slide, please. So this question about governance models, and this is my last collection of slides about how do we govern GPI itself, and where is the power in the design process and the inclusivity there. Next slide, please. So there's some research around governance evaluation lenses. And so Cohane, he has this collection of ideas that you can look at to understand and evaluate governance of various organizations or systems. So democratic participation, efficiency, accountability, and two different types of legitimacy of the thing that is being governed. Do you have input legitimacy, which is related to inclusive decision-making within that thing, so within GPI and how it's designed, or output legitimacy? Do the outcomes actually, does it achieve its goals? Is there an outcome legitimacy? Next slide, please. There'll be a couple of clicks, I think, on this one. Forgive me. Thank you. So if we look at this through a design thinking lens, design theory recognizes it's rare to get a prototype right in the first iteration, and GPI is not beyond repair. It's simply in its early iterations. And so we can think of, there's a design artifact, which is the GPI metric itself. And then there's the design intervention, which is the way that GPI becomes an intervention, gets like the uptake of GPI. And so some leaders in design thinking, Brown and Martins, this is a direct quote from them: "If a designer simply imposes his own ideas, buying would depend largely on his authority, not the context conducive to social transformation." And so best practices, both from design thinking and the OECD handbook, would say that involvement of experts and stakeholders is really important, that there ought to be user empathy. Who's using this? Probably policymakers to make changes. And so also this idea of prototyping. It might help with GPI adoption. And so not just designing the artifact itself, but the intervention also. And as Senge has said, quote, "Bringing about significant changes in larger systems require building networks connecting many different organizations and even different types of organizations. So this idea of inclusivity and participation in the process." Next slide, please. There's only 2 slides left. So this is one, and then there's one more. So in this, we were looking at what could be models to understand how to design the artifact of GPI and how to get the intervention to be uptaken by the system. And so right now, maybe our current governance is, there's some people say that there's this threshold of maybe state uptake, like can we get a certain number of states to start using it? That could be considered an intervention for the uptake of this. The artifact has mainly been designed within academia, in peer-reviewed journals, and also by states. And so that's maybe, and we could maybe disagree on what is our current governance model, but we can look to see how did the GDP become its artifact and its intervention. And so we can see that that was government initiated. It had output legitimacy at the time. If we wanted to go this route, government, maybe the 21st century has a different model than when we took GDP up. But we could look at the UN or the OECD or the IMF or maybe the World Bank potentially, or we could look at Department of Commerce. We were just looking at us and the US. And then this other side, the Global Reporting Initiative is sustainability reporting metrics used by businesses. It's really had big uptake, and it was a nonprofit initiated program that now is really big and really reputable, has a lot of input legitimacy because it had a lot of democratic participation. And so maybe a nonprofit space to house governance for GPI could be like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance or something like that. But this question about to whom and what does GPI give power, we can see that in our governance and in our design processes, we have a question of power there. Last slide, please. So while it would be contrary to the spirit of this idea of inclusion and best practices for design to offer a fully formed new GPI, based on the research, there's a couple of different suggestions towards the next generation of GPI. And so things like championing inclusion, collaboration, and diversity in the design process, highlighting the policy leverage points and policy relevance, prioritizing creating transparency in the governance process itself, committing to a clear theoretical framework that may be updated over time because of our understanding of concepts of sustainability evolving, seeking comparability with other types of outcomes, and perhaps maintaining ease of comparability with GDP. And my last or closing thought related to this is there is Senge talks about in systems thinking, there's no ultimate solution that is exactly what is. We don't need to think of that as what's needed. There was no single plan for the Industrial Revolution. No ministry was put in charge of it existing. No business singly led the way. So this idea that nudges like new metrics shift how resources are allocated in a system, and it maybe could slow the bleeding so that we can address the bigger systems problems. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mary Jane. Really interesting. Lucille, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, thank you.
Please to the next slide.
Yep.
So I'm delighted to be on this panel. Hi, everyone. I will be situating GPI in the context of competing alternative measures of current welfare. And so in relation to these two issues, measuring what matters and guiding policy, which incidentally is the title of my variant of the title of my recently published article in the International Labor Review. Can we go to the next slide, please? I suggest that the prominent current beyond GDP measures are the following, and these are also illustrative of the approaches that have been taken. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, but I contend that these are the sort of the leading alternatives at the moment. Now, review of these measures, which is I think I do in my ILR paper, shows that there is no perfect measure. Each has theoretical or practical shortcomings, and of course GPI gets a sort of a heavy share, large share of some of the critiques or perhaps silences in that regard. And because of as a monetary metric, it sort of relies on imputed values and which some deem as arbitrary. But rest assured, the other metrics also have problems that have been pointed out in the literature. And secondly, most of these indicators fail to respond to the critiques of GDP, even though they are sort of emerging in the context of critique of GDP. And they are not equipped to address major challenges of our times. And I have, of course, the ecological degradation, climate change, inequality as sort of important challenges. And yet these challenges, of course, can adversely affect our well-being. Next slide, please. Now, in this landscape, GPI stands out as the most responsive to the shortcomings of GDP and is more comprehensive or unique, in fact, in incorporating non-market contributors to and detractors from welfare. So, of course, inequality, care work, care for the environment, overwork, underwork. These are the issues that are important for GPI, are components of GPI. Importantly, as a monetary indicator, GPI is uniquely suited. Maybe that's a very strong claim. I'm open to further discussion on that, but I believe GPI is strongly suited to evaluate policy proposals. And this is often an overlooked aspect in discussions of beyond GDP indicators as a valuable aspect of an indicator. So GPI then is, I'm arguing, is superior in measuring what matters and in guiding policy compared to the prominent alternatives. Now, my argument here is that these advantages of GPI, especially usefulness for policy making, should be utilized more by GPI researchers if GPI is to be widely adopted and used to inform policy. Next slide, please. Now, typically, GPI studies focus on comparison of GPI per capita with GDP per capita trends. And of course, having participated in the Utah study, I know that reaching this point where we can show these trends is kind of an ultimate step. And basically, this step has a powerful message. Our total consumption is not growing as fast as the GDP trend. And of course, in some cases, it's stagnating or even declining, as we know based on studies. But in addition to this use of a single value GPI, GPI is also a framework, and I argue a set of satellite accounts. We can call them a set of satellite accounts. Each component is an account, and herein we have an opportunity, I think, kind of using the framework where we can develop a better GPI in each of the accounts. I mean, I have in mind gender inequality adjusted measurement of some of the social components, unpaid labor, leisure, underemployment, for example. But we could also, I mean, race came up today, and of course our context is right now racial justice or injustice. Certainly at the local state level, it is feasible to develop GPI in a manner that incorporates these other inequalities. And then the framework can be developed for making policy simulations. And so next slide, please. So just sort of let's remember that in terms of policy, the primary purpose of measuring welfare is to inform policy. Yet measurement does not guarantee policy use. And in this regard, in the indicator landscape, we can raise two questions. Is the indicator useful for policy purposes? And is it being used for policy? And next slide, please. Now, on the first question, I contend that only GPI is suitable for a set of tasks relevant for policymaking. As a monetary indicator, it allows meaningful interpretation of percent change in value of the indicator. The other contending metrics cannot do that. You can't talk about percentage change of an index and kind of infer meaningful policy implications from that. And a dashboard, of course, cannot tell how decision makers will use them to make trade-offs, for example. So these sort of policy tasks that come up can be answered with a monetary indicator. And of course, we have GPI researchers have sort of taken that step and attempted to use GPI in policy simulations and scenarios. Of course, Bagstad and Shaman have done so for estimating the effect of on GPI of converting vacant lots into urban gardens. Talbert has attempted to estimate raising the impact of the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage. And so these are kind of definitely, this is definitely a sort of a frontier that we should go in. Next slide, please. The second, on the second question, except for the Human Development Index, beyond GDP and sustainability indicators have not had much of an impact on shaping policy. And this is true for GPI as well. And of course, I'm here drawing upon the analysis of Blaze and Whitby for Belgium and Germany, and Hayden Wilson for the case of Maryland. And so there's sort of a list of issues that have prevented GPI from being more widely used in policymaking, or used at all in policymaking. Of course, in Belgium and Germany, the crisis context was relevant. You know, that basically there was a sort of reversion back to finding GDP growth attractive in that context. And of course, the infrequent releases of GPI was not helpful for users. An overlapping issue that comes up in both of these studies is skepticism of GPI's usefulness in moving towards sustainability. Of course, there is the issue of dominance of personal consumption in GPI, and that it's overwhelming all the other costs. And as a monetary measure, it's sort of, there's skepticism that these are market values are seeping into measurement of welfare, and sort of the slippery slope concerns are there. And so we are losing, I would say, some contingents here in supporting the GPI. So that's a powerful issue. And then there is, of course, in the case of Maryland, it was more of a top-down kind of adoption exercise, and therefore there was limited grassroots support for GPI, and then there were difficulties embedding GPI in the government policy process, bureaucratic inertia, timely release issues, fiscal notes issues, and so forth. But but what this says is GPI is most suitable, if not uniquely so, for policy use, but not being used as such. Next slide, please. Obviously, this is a problem. This is my last slide. So I want to address two challenges of GPI. One is, of course, this non-standard methodology and increasing methodological divergence issue. And now I think this is a good thing, in fact, that there is a divergence in methodology, because people are invested in GPI and they are developing it to incorporate cutting edge scholarship. But of course, the downside is that undermines cross-country comparability, cross-state comparability, and attractiveness of GPI to potential users. So the task here is, of course, the standardization and a methodological reset. And on this, of course, there's an active debate with lots of ideas on what should the next version of GPI looks like. Perhaps the bigger challenge, I think, is the politics and political economy of measurement, I would say. And of course, Mary sort of got into this aspect of the problem, which is a bigger problem, but I will raise the following issues. By design, GPI aims full cost accounting of our economic process, and of course, this runs counter to the goal of growth without internalizing costs. So I believe this animates some of the critiques of GPI, or the silent treatment that GPI gets, and it's an issue to address. So how can we address this issue? Well, I think our task is to show policy relevance of GPI to grassroots constituencies, win back sort of the ecological contingents that are sort of skeptical, but also feminist economists that are kind of not embracing such a measure, even though it incorporates care work as an important contributor to our welfare. And then we have to raise greater awareness of sustainability issues through the tool of GPI. In doing so, we have to include grassroots constituencies in the process, but how do we do that? Obviously, policy scenarios and simulations of local issues is going to be very important. Whatever is the local issue, the GPI local contingent team has to sort of come up to task and essentially try and flesh it out. And to do so, even without kind of awaiting our standardization of a 2.1, 2.2, whatever version we are naming here of the GPI. And then, of course, our reporting practices have to be consistently transparent. And I refer to, of course, here sensitivity analyses, and then, of course, obviously, it has to also be inclusive in the sense of inclusive of local groups, local communities, and basically be humble in terms of regarding GPI, or presenting GPI as one input, one tool in our well-being assessment, and hearing out other values and other metrics to the extent that they are in the conversation. So that's where I'll end.
Thanks, Conseli. So we're up at 10 o'clock now. I know I let the presenters go on a little bit further because it was just really interesting stuff to say, and I wanted to be able to throw those ideas out there. So at this point, I have a quick presentation. I'm not really going to go through the whole thing because I want to allow enough time for questions. So I would encourage people. I see there's been some conversations taking place in the chat box, but if people have questions for the previous speakers, can you please go ahead and start entering them within the chat box now? I myself have questions that I throw out within my presentation, so I'll just touch upon those as people are, recording their questions. And Erin, if you wouldn't mind just keeping track of the questions in the chat box, that would be great. So, so as I mentioned before, Kirsten Olson and I have worked on a GPI for the state of Hawaii, and we've been, as I'm sure most of you have been, we've been spending a lot of brain power these last couple of weeks thinking about well-being and social welfare and the work that we're doing now that we're in the time of coronavirus. So I thought I'd throw some questions out here, just trying to put in perspective what the other speakers have said, but really what is it that, if we're talking about GPI and if we're talking about, the crisis that we're currently experiencing, not just with COVID-19, but, what's been happening the past week or so. These are questions that keep popping up in my mind based on the discussions I've been having with my colleagues in Hawaii. So within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, what can GPI tell us that GDP does not, that GDP cannot tell us? And this is one we just authored an op-ed for a local paper just this week that really tries to get at this, that if we're going to try to move beyond what's happening now and to build back better, that's that second point here, which I just chose to put in build back better. There's many different phrases that are out there, but the idea is if we're going to move beyond this, do we focus on the same old growth economy and on GDP? And if not, how can we make better decisions and better informed decisions? So does GPI have a role that it can play within that, especially as compared to GDP? And if there is a role that GPI can play, is that going to impact what, efforts to really update or strengthen GPI? And Gonzalo, you mentioned GPI 2.1, 2.2, whatever version. So so those are questions that I'd like to throw out there just to think about. Again, we talked the GPI that we developed for the state of Hawaii, which I talked about before. We termed it the GPI island style. Our argument was to really localize the GPI framework. We based ours on the Maryland-Vermont framework. How can we localize that, to what advantage, and what pieces would be missing or modified or updated to best fit the needs of living on an island here in Hawaii. But so these are just some things I want to throw out in the current conditions. If I break it down to economic and social and environmental, just and the three facets of GPI, what are some ideas that we see now in Hawaii? Now that we're in the midst of COVID, we see, these are photos that just shock us from our local newspaper here, right? To see Waikiki Beach in midday completely empty is just, something that's never been seen before. The photo below is, these are rental cars that are being stored in the parking lot at Aloha Stadium because we have no tourists. Obviously our economy is dependent on jobs that are related to the tourism industry. We saw this dramatic drop in total passenger counts after our governor put forth a 14-day quarantine period for anyone who's coming to the islands. And you can see as compared to last year. And the irony of it is that up until last year, we were approaching 10 million visitors. It's an all-time high of the number of tourists coming to Hawaii. But at the same time, a survey of residents, it was a all-time low of residents, locals, vision or their sentiment towards visitors at the same time was an all-time low. So there's this whole kind of irony that's going on. And again, within the context of GPI, GDP definitely can't pick up on those things, but can GPI, should GPI, and how can GPI pick up on some of those sentiments or some of those factors that play into our well-being here living in Hawaii. Just a couple of environmental aspects. Fortunately, our Public Utilities Commission is still pushing through a lot of renewable energy projects to try to reach our 2045 goal of 100% renewable energy for electricity. And they're using the COVID-19 crisis as a way of even promoting those renewable energy projects even more, because they will provide immediate jobs, and those are green jobs. At the same time, some other positives that are coming out of our limitations on the flow of tourists, that anecdotally some scientists are seeing some, bounce back increases in water clarity and the number of fish within some of our famous places, famous beaches along the coast and around the island. We have a high dependence on importing food and other products. This is a really scary time period to see that our supply chains could have been disrupted. Something else to try to impact from a policymaker's point of view, and can GPI be helpful to do that? And of course, some of the social factors that go into play for how we live here on the island. We've all been switched to distance learning and using the internet, but we're very limited by what broadband that we have, and we are dependent on, antiquated cables in order to provide internet for us. So how does that happen? What are the equity issues that come into, the families or, children of families that don't have access to the internet for distance learning? But then on the other hand, volunteerism that other speakers remarked about has been up. So we have a very strong sense of family and social connections here in Hawaii. It's called Ohana. We refer to it as Ohana. And how is that being further visualized or exemplified throughout what's been happening through the COVID crisis? There's many other issues that I just have pictures here that point to the fact that the homeless issues, the cost of living is so high here. We have a houselessness issue because there's many working homeless because the cost of having a place to live is so high, cost of living is so high overall, that continues to be a problem. And how is that going to be, how is that going to respond to the COVID crisis into the future, near term and long term? So I put some pictures up here, some examples of lots of the efforts that are taking place here in Hawaii, a lot of the brain power that's being used to talk about this particular situation. And, so I throw out to the community, of GPI researchers, is this a time that we can kind of reactivate a lot of the interest in GPI and gain some more traction? And if so, how can we do that? And what's the best way forward? So I abbreviated my session here. Hopefully we have some time left to take some questions. So Erin, if you want to come on in and see if, here's my thank you slide here, and here's my contact information. I always get this is one of my neighbors' license plate down the street with the GDP. I always have to put that out there for to remind me of our alternative measures to GDP. So with that being said, Erin, would you like to come on mic and see if
actually have a lot of kid background noise. So if someone else wanted to run through the chat window, maybe John or Regina, that would be great.
Okay. Let's see, or Rob, if you have some input there too.
Yeah, Anna Maria Conley had a really good point here, asking why GPI is trying to be full cost accounting. Well, saying that it seems to be a full cost accounting version of GDP, but then also brings in these other aspects of well-being that might not necessarily be so well measured with dollars and cents. And I would say to that, I mean, like someone like Martha Nussbaum would say, maybe we shouldn't be trying to commensurate these different types of measures, that instead we should just be trying to understand the individual measures as well as we can, and then sort of leave it up to the democratic process to do the commensurating. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I actually I've had a lot of trouble with the inequality measure because off of the models that I've used, and we basically just scale the inequality. We scale down personal consumption based off of an inequality baseline, and who's to say that that kind of linear scaling is the right way to talk about what the dollar value of inequality is. I don't know. Maybe there's some theory behind that that I don't understand as well as I should. If someone else on the panel can speak to that more, I'd love to learn about that.
I'll jump in quickly and just say, and I don't know if the linear measure is the right way, but I think inequality in income, that definitely has theory behind it around the marginal utility of income, right? It's a very basic idea to say, like, if you give $1 or $50 to a very poor person, that is worth a lot more than if you give $50 to a very rich person. So if we have like one very rich person who just gets more and more money, it doesn't improve the economy and the well-being of people nearly as much as if it's much less income. I think that's the basic, the loose paraphrase of the theory behind it. I think there's some meaning there.
And if I may add, one of the reasons, Anna Maria, thanks for joining. She's one of my colleagues, and I'm so grateful that she joined. One of the reasons I think originally given for the idea of GPI directly being able to be a substitute for like GDP inside policy notes. You'll have like what do we predict will happen to gross state product or GDP with this kind of policy? And the idea that it would be a one number way. It's almost, I don't know if everyone would agree with this, but it's almost like the idea of like GPI might be like natural gas as opposed to oil, like trying to move us kind of away from the really bad, but it's still going to be imperfect and not great. But this idea that we've gotten so used, especially as policymakers, this idea of like we've gotten used to looking at GDP. So can we replace a dollar figure with another dollar figure, which is completely imperfect thing to do, but that it's better than the old one to transition us away. So I think that was one of the original arguments for having this like $1 figure to another dollar figure. So yeah, maybe it's like the natural gas transition in the energy economy. I don't know.
What is it? It's a bridge alternative indicator.
Yeah, it might be.
Because
can we really measure these things in dollars? No, but is that what we've habitually been doing? And could it be that bridge? Yeah.
Sally, do you have some comment on that? Or?
Yeah, I do. Once you look under the hood of GPI, you see all the problems, obviously. So, but my personal commitment to GPI has to do with this, bridge issue, and that it's a communication tool to essentially get more people on board. But I also don't think GPI really replaces GDP, because it's GDP is just measuring market exchanges, and there will always be GDP, but we will always need that. But it should not be our economic performance measure. Our economic performance measure should be GPI, in the sense of how well our welfare is generated. That what I would say would be the definition of GPI, an economic performance measure.
So I always try to stress that it's almost like the process is more important than the product. That GPI is a process-oriented framework. So the fact that you're going through and you're eliciting comments from community groups and policymakers, and it's like creating a tent under which everyone can come and talk. So I always try to at least frame it in that reference of that the process is more important than the product.
But also politically, you can address obviously the policymakers, right? So speak their language. If you want to see a single number, well, here's a single number, and then underneath that, underneath that framework, you could also do, development of, in a better way, the indicator. So.
I wanted to just draw attention. I saw several comments that, and I think, Rob, that you brought this up in your talk about baselines. Can we just spend a minute to talk a little bit about baselines and, that it can be controversial? Should we get rid of baselines? yeah, we're going to get rid of them. What are we going to use instead? So any comments that you all have about the idea of using baselines? Rob, did you make a comment on that earlier? Or,
yeah, I mean, I was basically, I just started doing this a couple of years ago, so I still feel like I'm learning a little bit about this, but I wonder about where baselines come from and what an ideal, we start from a certain baseline, a standardized baseline across all states, and we're really talking about state measurement in this panel, for like how much forest cover there should be, for how much farm cover there should be, for how much wetland coverage there should be. I mean, who's to say what that in the given year we've chosen the right year for that? I mean, maybe we have. I just don't know what basis that's built on, and I wonder if an alternative that's more based on the external benefits of a certain per acre or something like that. Whether we're using contingent valuation studies about the folks valuation of that land in wilderness, or if we're using other sorts of external benefits that come from health, or reductions in risk of death, or other measures that we use, whether that would be better than I mean, with farmland, we use a market valuation per acre as the standard way to calculate. So I don't know if other people are using something different from that, but that's what I've seen as the most commonly used one, and that seems like the wrong way to evaluate, because we come up with problems like I showed, which was that the biggest cost over the past 10 years in Ohio was the increase in value that farmers had in their farmland.
Mm-hmm.
If I can share about the baselines for the 50-state study, Alaska won out because they have the baseline number for their watershed services was calculated, and then we got new information and they suddenly have a lot more, but it's not like all the that's as useful. It's I think that Alaska won out in the game, not because policymakers did anything to make there be more conserved lands. And I think that it really showed to me that this baseline problem, especially when you're thinking about policymakers' capacity to make change and to have GPI drive policy towards more sustainable options, it seemed like the baseline didn't actually help that happen.
And one thing that we struggled with in Hawaii too was that, sure, you can have a baseline, like how you choose the baseline in terms of forests, for example, is one thing, but then, how do we determine the difference between, new forests and old forests, especially here in Hawaii when we have such a value that's placed, a cultural value and, recreational value, not besides the ecosystem services value of, older ohia forests, native forests. Then how do you take it from there? So that's not even just about the baselines; it's about the quality of what you have within your baseline. So makes it even more difficult. Conseli, did you have anything to weigh in on the baselines before we switch over?
No, I mean the points have been made, so I will.
Okay, good. I'm just curious. Some of the questions that I threw out there, has anybody else, with it, we've been spending so much, emotional time and time and effort spent on, looking at current events. But has anyone else come across within their states or within their context of using GPI to try to plan for post-COVID, or, in terms of even choosing projects or in choosing recovery plans? Has anyone else in their own home circumstances had GPI come up?
These policy briefs that we're doing are really focused on trying to show that you can raise revenue to close state budget gaps and also grow the economy, if you look at the economy from a comprehensive welfare measurement perspective. So when you're doing things like implementing road pricing, like raising the gas tax, like implementing a cap and trade program under a GDP measurement, you might see that as hurting the economy. But when you take into account reductions in use of non-renewables, reductions in commute times that can happen from some of these interventions, and especially reductions in CO2 emissions. I mean, these can be really, these can be welfare increasing and raise revenue to be able to provide for social services and important state programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, great point. Anybody else? I see Brent Blaze. Oh, hi, Brent. I see he just wrote in the chat box that no, hasn't used GPI to talk about post-COVID-19 plans here in Belgium. But he did have another comment here that one of the many problems that we as researchers and entrepreneurs, oh, I just lost it. Where did it go? So, oh yeah, that this, I think we all kind of feel this, right? That the methodology is not fully optimal. So maybe we're not pushing it as hard as we could. And he said that that applies to him at least. And I do feel the same way, Brent. So any comments from the other panelists on, you know, because it's not perfect, the methodology is not perfect, then, you know, kind of, are we risking our credibility by, you know, staking a claim on GPI, or have any of the other panelists felt the same way, or how do you deal with that?
I think one benefit I have as an analyst instead of a researcher is that I'm very okay with saying that none of these measurements are good, but they're going to push us in the right direction. You know, I'm just looking for improvements. I'm not necessarily looking for the perfect solution, and I'm willing to have sort of these open conversations, and we need to have these conversations about how to improve GPI. But I'm pretty sure if we follow this, if we use this measurement to inform our policy making, it's going to move things in the right direction. Ultimately, what I'm interested in.
Jane, you have anything on that one, or Eli?
I have a couple of points. I mean, in terms of methodology, the 2014 paper that Ken and Erica Gaddis and I wrote kind of outlined some of the options in terms of methodological improvements. And I mean, I think there's a sort of a little bit of a how do I want to phrase this? Like a respect for the legacy of GPI kind of thinking, sort of a little bit of a resistance to, I mean, trying to maintain continuity of the methodology, I think is one kind of interest people have. So, and obviously comparability is an important issue, but it's, you know, we also have to take the step and bite the bullet and drop, as I guess Mary Jane just posted, drop some of the non-functioning components or methods that have been used, and just to bite the bullet in that regard, and just you know, really reset the best scholarly approaches here in our GPI measure. So, I mean, for example, this summer, this fall, we're gonna, a couple of us, actually a team of 3 at University of Utah, we're gonna try and come up with the new estimates of Utah GPI, which is very overdue, of course, so all of these issues are going to come up, but as individual researchers, right, we're going to basically be making our own individual methodological improvements to the extent that we can. And then another study, say from another part of the country, comes up and they make their own individual choices. So we're never kind of approaching a unified kind of methodological resetting. And so that's what I worry about. But unless we have a kind of a big institution supporting GPI, I don't think there is a solution to that. I mean, it's a resource issue, it's a funding issue. We're all individually engaged in estimating GPI, and you know, there is no kind of a research group to kind of basically vet all of these methodologies and kind of come up with blueprints and so forth. So this is the problem.
Yeah, for sure.
That's why I'm sort of saying one more point. That's why I'm saying if we can sort of in individual research show the relevance of GPI, policy relevance of GPI, and win more supporters, then we might find some kind of a foundation willing to fund and sort of a GPI institute somewhere or something. But unless we show that, it's like really hard to, we're drowning in these sort of negative criticisms of GPI, and you know, these alternatives are, you know, bad mouthing us. So there's all this competition, underlying competition, you know, for attention as the best metric to use.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's kind of like, you know, how many students can you get to update your GPI? You know, like it's almost like we revert to trying to leverage whatever funds that we have to. And I think it's a great tool to work with students and to engage students. So I'm not criticizing it that way, but it's almost like, you know, how do you, if you don't have the funding to do it, how do you proceed? Previously, I know Demos had funded back in I think maybe 2014, 2013, had funded some workshops on GPI, and I agree. I mean, I think there needs to be some kind of champion that we can appeal to and try to gain some more momentum on this. And there's also a GPI 2.0 working group. Hasn't really had much traction recently, so maybe it's time to re-up that. And I'd also like to draw attention to one of the comments in the chat box about someone suggesting that if you tie GPI in with other activities, like particularly with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that might be a way to go. And I found that looking at Hawaii is a local hub for SDGs. It's been designated as a local hub for looking how do you implement SDGs at local levels. And there's many overlaps with GPI, and I agree that could be a potential springboard to incorporate the type of holistic framework that GPI provides to, you know, to illustrate and to, especially to illustrate the systemic ideas and holistic ideas that the SDGs try to capture. So I'm looking at time now, we're at 10:30. I think at this point we've, you know, way exceeded our time, but not for, I think this is, you know, there's many more conversations to follow about GPI still. I think there's still a lot of rich conversations and collaborations perhaps, and research opportunities that are still out there. So I just, you know, last 30 seconds, any of the other panelists have a tidbit to say, anything they want to throw out there before we end?
Thanks everyone who stuck around.
Thanks to everybody who stuck around. Is that what you said, Rob?
Yeah, and thanks to Regina for hosting this and for very on the fly becoming the slide advancer too. When my computer wasn't working, you really stepped up. So thanks.
Perfecting my clicking skills. You know, I haven't even had a cup of coffee yet today, right? Because I mean, so thank you for your patience with that.
Thank you all for doing it.
Okay.
It's great to be together chatting.
The recording should be ready in about a day or two.
Questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks for all the participants. Thanks for everybody to join us, and we hope to meet again sometime soon to continue this.
Good job. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
All
Have
right.
a great day.
Stay safe, healthy.
Bye. Okay. Bye.